First, Israel cannot sustain this war for even a day without full U.S. backing, both militarily and financially. So this is to a large extent a U.S. war. When Netanyahu says at the podium of the United Nations that the long arm of Israel extends across the Middle East, he's talking about the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. military. There's a lot of bravado, but Israel depends completely on the U.S. and the U.S. Also uses Israel as Israel uses the U.S. In these wars. The effect of the war itself is, of course, devastating to the Israeli economy, which has been twice downgraded in its credit rating. Now it's at the level just barely investment grade. It will be further downgraded by the credit rating agencies. This will be a major blow to the normal economic functioning. The military costs are enormous. The damage, the dislocation, the costs to the labor supply, which is now in the army rather than in the offices and in the direct production in the economy, is also an enormous cost. So this is all the more reason for this war to end. It's in nobody's interest. It's absolute disaster for first the Palestinian people, of course, for Lebanon, but also for Israel, and I would say for the U.S., which is now complicit in what I do regard as a genocidal action by Israel. The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, is still deliberating whether Israel is in violation of the 1948 Genocide Convention, but I surmise that it is.
Now, if this war continues to escalate to the point where the U.S. and Israel are directly attacking Iran, and Iran is responding with all of its capabilities, and recognizing how difficult it is to make predictions about the consequences economically for that type of a war in the region, what, broadly speaking, would you expect the impacts on the global economy to be?
The problem, first and foremost, is that a war like this not only is guaranteed to kill vast numbers of people, but it could also escalate into yet another great power confrontation between the United States and Russia quite easily. The fact of the matter is Iran itself is a powerful country. It has hypersonic ballistic missiles, according to all recent evidence. It can attack Israel. It can penetrate the Iron Dome. It can do grave damage to population centers and to military and infrastructure targets in Israel. Israel, of course, can do great damage back, especially if the United States is complicit in this, which it almost surely would be directly. It would probably not only give the green light, but be operationally involved in targeting, in providing intelligence, space surveillance, and so as well as the direct munitions themselves. Iran is an ally of Russia. If Iran is being pummeled by a U.S.-Israel combination of forces, I would expect in some way that Russia would become involved and we would have a two-front war with Russia. This is dangerous beyond imagining, except the imagining of our lame brains who actually run things or think they run things in Washington. It's dangerous beyond imagining because Russia has 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons, as does the United States, and roughly 6,000 total, including those in stockpile. The latest idiocy from the U.S. is we shouldn't worry about that. That's just a bluff and so forth. Well, these people are not good at almost any assessments that they make strategically. This is the gang that loses everything and that gambles wrong on everything and makes the predictions wrong on everything, so that when they tell me not to worry, it probably quadruples my level of worry, which is high enough to begin with.
And mine too, for what it's worth. Which this actually brings me to an assessment that French anthropologist Emmanuel Todd offered of the global geopolitical situation in early 2023, before the war erupted in West Asia. And according to Emmanuel Todd, at that point in time, World War III had already begun. And he went on to explain that this is now a struggle, the struggle between Russia and its allies, particularly China, on the one hand, and the United States and its allies, or others like me might call them vassals, on the other side, which must end in the collapse of one or the other side. That was the view articulated by Emmanuel Todd. Do you believe that we are in that kind of a struggle, or is it fair to say that we are now in a world war?
It's interesting. Pope Francis has been saying that for a decade, that we are already in a world war. And it's terrifying to hear that, because he's, of course, one of the most profound observers in the world. Emmanuel Todd is no slouch. He's an absolute outstanding observer as well. We are definitely in a struggle between the United States and its allies and the China, Russia, and more generally BRICS countries. It's a struggle that the BRICS countries, that is China, Russia, and the other members of the BRICS, are not choosing, in my opinion, but are responding to. What is this struggle about? It is the struggle based on a delusion. The delusion is the U.S. delusion that it is the world's superpower, sole superpower. It's the delusion of American hegemony. It's the delusion that America leads the world and should lead the world. And of course, this is the usual mantra or claptrap, I would say, of U.S. Foreign policy pronouncements. But it's absurd, because most of the world does not want to be led by the United States, does not want to be threatened by the United States. We have a war in Ukraine because Russia does not accept the United States military on its border, specifically on the Russia-Ukraine border. That's the whole basis of why there is a Ukraine war. Russia does not accept the United States deciding who rules in Ukraine. And certainly the war broke out in 2014 because that's when the fighting broke out, after the United States participated in a coup to overthrow the Ukrainian president. Russia doesn't accept that. China does not accept the United States sending arms to Taiwan, or senior U.S. officials visiting Taiwan without the Chinese assent, because China says there's one China. The United States signed on to that. And China says the United States should respect China's sovereignty and not meddle in the internal affairs of China. I also subscribe to that, because the last thing in the world we need is a war between the United States and China. But for these neocons who run things in Washington and their vassals in Canada, Britain, and Western Europe, what the U.S. says goes. And this is the real problem. Putin eventually, after really more than 2 decades of trying to negotiate with the United States, and the U.S. kept saying it's none of your business what we do, Putin acted sharply in February 2022. This war was utterly avoidable. At least this last escalation of the war in February 2022. The war was also avoidable in February 2014. The United States should not be in the business of regime change operations, period. Period. Let me say it again. It's a core doctrine of the UN system: no interference in the internal affairs of another country. It's so simple. If we behave that way, we would avoid disaster. But the United States believes it can interfere anywhere, covertly, overtly, open war, coups, secret operations, and the rest of the so-called U.S. alliance just salutes.
So I'd like to drill down on the situation in the occupied territories. You and Sybil Forrest, I hope I'm not mispronouncing.
Yes, that's correct. She's my colleague at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network.
Right. You just argued with Ms. Forrest in an op-ed, a just published op-ed. You made some argument. You made a case about why the two-state solution has not been realized as of yet. And in addition, you responded to the claim, which many of us have been hearing for many years, that the reason why the negotiations at Camp David broke down in 2000 was because the Palestinians, led by Yasser Arafat, allegedly rejected this generous Israeli proposal for a Palestinian state. Could you elaborate on what the reality of the breakdown of the negotiations was, and why? What is the motivation, in your view, for Israel having vigorously opposed the creation of a Palestinian state all these years?
Well, let's start with that. Going back already to the Balfour Declaration, there was grave unrest and confrontation between the Arab population, which inhabited what is today Palestine and Israel, and the British imperial promise of a homeland to the Jewish people. When Britain was not owner of the land, this was Ottoman land, but in typical British imperial form, they promised the land actually several times over. They promised it to the French in the Sykes-Picot Treaty. They promised it to the Arabs in the McMahon letters, and they promised it to the Jews. The British are nothing if not cynical and conniving. That's how they had an empire. It lasted for a long time. The behavior is gross and destabilizing. And so they set the trap for more than 100 years of conflict in the Middle East by promising land that wasn't theirs to a population that wasn't there. and then came the Jewish influx, and the Palestinian Arabs rejected it from the beginning, said, this is our country. Who tells you to come here? The British were the imperial authority, so-called mandatory authority, up until 1947, when they threw their hands up, especially at the face of Jewish terrorism, in fact, that was killing the British, for example, in the bombing of the King David Hotel. And after the Holocaust in Europe under Hitler, the surviving Jewish refugees were given by the U.S. and Britain more or less the decision go to Palestine. So tragedy, disaster, conflict had been there for 30 years since the Balfour Declaration in 1917. In 1947, the UN proposed a partition plan. It's interesting. At the time, the Palestinians were about 66% of the population, the Jews about 33%, roughly. But the land was given in roughly the reverse order, most going to is what would be Israel, and less than half going to Palestine. The Palestinians rejected it. The Arab nations rejected it. Israel declared independence. And Israel used terror to chase away hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their homes in what the Palestinians call the Nakba, the disaster. And that was 1947. So we're 77 years since then, and there's been no resolution of this crisis. There have been generations of refugees, and Israel rejected, from then till now, a state of Palestine. Yes, there have been talks, but Israel never was going to allow a state of Palestine. This, from their point of view, was a matter of prevarication, a matter of delay, but they thought for two main reasons, never. The two main reasons are our security. We don't accept the state of Palestine. And increasingly over time, not at the beginning, but from the 1990s onward, a almost messianic movement or a believer in messianism of religious nationalists, ultra-religious rabbis preaching we must settle the occupied lands of Palestine, which were lands captured in the 1967 war, because God promised us those lands. This itself is a long digression, but 2,600 years ago, a book called the Book of Joshua was written and incorporated into the Jewish Bible. And that book purported to describe events of hundreds of years earlier, in which the book claimed that God gave the Jews all the land from the Euphrates to the Mediterranean Sea. And for religious zealots, they're reading this 2,600-year text and saying, well, that's it. That's what we're going to do. That's how we're going to behave. And people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir in the current cabinet have zealots as followers who are reading an ancient text. And that text, by the way, again, in a digression, documents or purports to document, because it's not even a historical text, but it claims to be, documents how the Israelites conquered the land of Canaan by several genocides. Supposedly God commanded genocides. The whole thing is completely mixed up in that you have one side that says we are going to rule over Palestinians because we don't accept them having a state because that would endanger us. And another side saying, well, God gave us this anyway, so don't you dare give it away. This is Jewish land, and we're redeeming God's plan. Well, it's hard to make a recipe for more of a mess than this. But the only thing I would add is that the Israel lobby has basically bought the U.S. Congress and the White House through mega campaign donations over many decades, and by senior positions in the U.S. being even filled by people that are part of the Israeli Defense Forces, born in Israel. This is what's
like
called
Amos Hochstein,
exactly, called an honest broker. It's unbelievable. So Israel has these completely, in my view, unacceptable ideas backed by the United States military and by the U.S. government and by the Congress. So here we are. They don't want to compromise. They think that they can kill as many Palestinians, turn Gaza to rubble, invade Lebanon, smash Iran. The U.S. will do all those nice favors for them. That's fine. And that's how it's going to be. And some people believe that's the only way to peace. And some people believe it's the only way to God's plan. I don't know who's crazier, because both of these are completely wrong. The Arabs have been saying for 22 years vividly, clearly, we want two states, peace, mutual security, normalization of relations. They can't say it more clearly. And then Netanyahu and his gang say, oh, no one on the other side wants peace. And the Arabs say, but we do want peace. No one on the other side wants peace. And it's a kind of game For can you shout enough or bomb enough or kill enough political opposition of the other side or political negotiators so that you can say no one wants peace on the other side? Well, eventually, maybe you can make it a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's what they seem to want to do. But this is a disaster for Israel. It's a disaster for the world. It's a threat to escalation to yet another front on the U.S.-Russia war, and that means another path to escalation to nuclear war.
The whole question of the two-state solution now is, I think, fraught with difficulty because of the conditions that prevail in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. About 4 months ago, I think it was in June, the United Nations Development Program issued a report in which they said that assuming that reconstruction begins at some point in the reasonably near future in Gaza, if it were done at the same pace at which housing was reconstructed in prior conflicts, it would take 80 years just to restore the destroyed housing, let alone deal with the damaged housing, which is much larger, the quantity there. And of course, you have unexploded munitions. You have contaminants now that to a far higher level than before because of the munitions. And then in the West Bank, you have 700,000 to 800,000 settlers. As you've indicated, quite rightly, they are quite fanatical, many of them, if not the vast majority of them, and many of them are armed. And we've seen the degree to which they are willing to go, even under threat of U.S. sanctions, however symbolic they may be, some of these extremist settlers, in order to impose their will on the Palestinians and try to drive them out. So at this stage, is it even practicable to talk about a two-state solution? Isn't really, as a practical matter, the only path to justice and peace a single state in which Palestinians, Jews, and all others who reside in historic Palestine live together as equal citizens?
That would be fine, but that's far less likely than a two-state solution. That would mean actually the destruction of Israel as a state, whereas the two-state solution has Israel continuing, but alongside a Palestinian state. So you can choose, and either way is quite plausible. Either way is intellectually and morally defensible. But as a practical matter, one way destroys Israel, and the other way creates a Palestinian state alongside Israel. From my reading and understanding, it is the two-state solution that has nearly universal assent, is built into international law, and could be practicable. Of course, not easy. It would require UN force. It would require UN peacekeepers. It would require saying these are the borders. It would require imposing this on Israel. But you could impose one of two things. You could impose the end of Israel, or you could impose a state alongside Israel. I think imposing the end of Israel is probably less likely and more traumatic. It would not win a vote in the UN General Assembly or the Security Council, whereas the two-state solution wins overwhelming votes in both the General Assembly and the Security Council. So I view it as the right path going forward. It's hard enough. The other path may be a more acceptable path, but it's a less likely path, and it could really reach a kind of fever pitch of Armageddon if that were to be imposed, ending Israel as a Jewish sovereign state. But either way, from my point of view, you could defend either way intellectually, morally, politically, historically. But I do believe that the right approach is two states because we're actually very close to being able to do that. To my mind, there are two big obstacles. One is the U.S., not Israel, but the U.S., which vetoes this. But I think that the U.S. veto is a vote for war. It is not a vote for Israel's safety. It's not a vote for U.S. security interests. So I think it can, and it's not a vote that reflects the U.S. public opinion. And it isolates the U.S. Internationally. So I think the U.S. can change. Once that happens, then the Security Council can vote membership of Palestine as the 194th UN member state. International law has already defined the borders as the 4th of June, 1967. The Arab states have already said that this is what they seek. This is what the Palestine Authority seeks. Hamas has already said that it finds that acceptable. Iran has said it finds it's acceptable. So that would overcome a lot. You'd have unanimity other than Israel itself in the United Nations. Then there's the practical problem, which is, as you described, the reality on the ground. You know, I first went to Israel in 1972, so 52 years ago. The first thing that was explained to me was facts on the ground, that they're going to make settlements in occupied territories, illegal or not, to make facts on the ground. Well, they did it. They made everything vastly more complicated. So what does one say? Well, you've had 52 years of illegal settlement, so go keep it? I don't think so. That is what's happening right now as absolute recipe for war. So yes, there may have to be 10 years. Maybe the settlers can accept Palestinian citizenship. Maybe they're phased out over a 10-year period. There definitely would need to be UN peacekeepers. So I don't think that this is simple, and it's not a matter of an agreed solution. It's a matter of an imposed solution. But no solution is going to be agreed between Israel and the Palestinians. None. It's going to have to be imposed, or there's going to be continued mass bloodshed, an apartheid regime, and a threat of nuclear escalation.
Now, I know you have to go, Professor Sachs, but I did want to ask you just one more question, which I think you could respond to quite briefly. And that is, recently you were in a very interesting discussion with Professor John Mearsheimer. And in the course of that discussion, which people can see on YouTube, and I'm going to put a link to it in the description to this video, you both talked about the U.S. deep state. And to my surprise, because he is, after all, a realist, Professor Mearsheimer expressed the view that there are people, decision makers, key decision makers within the U.S. deep state, who believe that they are genuinely promoting liberal democracy around the world. And you had a spirited response to that assertion. I just wondered if you could share that with our audience today.
Yeah, I told John Mearsheimer, who's a good friend and a brilliant scholar, I told him, don't be such an idealist, John. Be a realist. Of course, I was joking because he's our lead realist. But a realist says that it is national interests and national survival, and that this promotion of democracy business is smoke and mirrors, delusion, a game. Maybe some people believe it, but don't take it too seriously. That's my experience of U.S. foreign policy. I've seen very little evidence that the U.S. cares anything about democracy. It's absolutely ready to overthrow democratic governments. It's ready to overthrow so-called authoritarian governments. It's ready to subvert any country at any time for U.S. interests, especially to put a new military base someplace. So I don't find the argument that there was idealistic nation building possible. If it is true, all I have to say is they are not only ill-willed and ill-directed, but so unbelievably incompetent, it exceeds my wildest definition of incompetence, because I've never seen a shred of evidence that they were actually interested in building any other country or certainly any other democracy.